Today is Monday, June 15th, 2026, and today is National Lobster Day, which is a celebration of a food that somehow went from being considered poor people's fare to one of the more expensive items on a restaurant menu. History does that sometimes. Things change value. Ideas change value. Entire systems change value. And today's stories ended up revolving around people trying to solve problems. A king's power, a medical emergency, and the universal challenge of finding lunch. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and your guide through the tiny historical details that somehow make humanity look even stranger. On June 15th, 1215, King John of England placed his seal on the Magna Carta. At the time, nobody was calling it one of the most important documents in political history. In fact, most of the people involved were focused on a much more immediate problem. They were angry. Very angry. King John had spent years alienating powerful nobles. Military failures had weakened confidence in his leadership. Taxes had increased. Disputes had piled up. Frustrations boiled over. Eventually, a group of barons forced negotiations. The result was the Magna Carta. Now here's the interesting part. The document wasn't originally intended to create modern democracy. It wasn't written as a declaration of universal human rights. It was essentially a list of demands designed to limit the king's power and protect certain legal privileges. Very specific concerns, very specific people. Yet history had larger plans. Because buried within the document were ideas that proved remarkably durable. The notion that rulers should follow laws. The notion that government power should have limits. The notion that legal processes matter. Those concepts would echo through centuries of political thought. One detail I enjoy is how quickly things fell apart afterward. King John attempted to undo the agreement. Conflict resumed. The document nearly disappeared. Had events unfolded slightly differently, the Magna Carta might have become a historical footnote instead of becoming a symbol. Centuries later, lawyers, politicians, and historians were still pointing back to it, not because every word remained relevant, but because the underlying idea survived. Power should have boundaries. That's a concept with remarkable staying power. And speaking of people trying to solve serious problems, June 15th also gave us one of the most ambitious medical experiments of its era. On June 15th, 1667, one of the earliest successful blood transfusions was reportedly performed. And if that sentence sounds slightly alarming, that's because medicine in the 17th century could be a very adventurous profession. Doctors knew blood mattered. What they didn't fully understand was why. The circulatory system had only recently been described in detail. Knowledge about blood types was still centuries away. Many of the biological principles modern medicine takes for granted had not yet been discovered. Yet, physicians were experimenting, trying to learn, trying to solve problems. The procedure most often associated with this date involved a French physician named Jean-Baptiste Denis. His patient was a teenage boy suffering from illness after repeated medical treatments. Rather than transfusing human blood, Denis used blood from a lamb, which sounds unusual today, because it was. Researchers at the time believed animal blood might possess beneficial qualities. The transfusion appeared to help, at least initially. News of the procedure spread rapidly across Europe. People were fascinated. Others were horrified. Some viewed it as a breakthrough. Others viewed it as reckless. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. Further experiments produced mixed results. Some patients improved. Others did not survive. Without knowledge of blood compatibility, doctors were working in dangerous territory. Eventually, many governments restricted or banned transfusion experiments. Yet, the idea itself survived. Scientists kept investigating. Knowledge improved. Blood types were discovered. Safety increased. And what began as a risky experiment eventually became one of the most important medical procedures in modern healthcare. Millions of lives have been saved through blood transfusions. That's quite a legacy for an idea that began with a physician, a patient, and a great deal of uncertainty. And after talking about government and medicine, let's turn to another problem humanity has been trying to solve for a very long time. What are we eating today? On June 15, 2016, archaeologists announced new findings related to ancient Roman fast food counters. And I love this story because it instantly changes how many people picture the ancient world. When people imagine Rome, they tend to think of emperors, legions, marble temples, grand speeches. What they don't usually imagine is somebody grabbing lunch on the way home from work. Yet that's exactly what many Romans did. Archaeologists studying ancient sites uncovered evidence of establishments known as thermopolia. There were street-side food counters built directly into busy neighborhoods. Large containers were embedded into stone counters. Prepared food would be stored inside. Customers would stop, purchase a meal, and continue with their day. In other words, fast food. 2,000 years ago. One detail that makes this especially interesting is that many Roman homes lacked extensive cooking facilities. For many residents, especially those living in crowded urban environments, purchasing prepared food was practical, convenient, affordable. Sound familiar? The menus were different, of course. Researchers have found evidence of foods including fish, meats, grains, and various seasonings. No drive-through windows. No combo meals. No promotional toys. But the underlying idea feels remarkably modern. People were busy. People were hungry. People wanted a quick meal. Some human experiences seem surprisingly resistant to change. What I enjoy most about discoveries like this is how they shrink the distance between us and the past. It's easy to view ancient Romans as distant historical figures. It's harder to do that when you realize they were standing at a food counter trying to decide what sounded good for lunch. And after spending today's episode around systems designed to make life work a little better, it feels fitting to end with someone whose life was shaped by a single decision that stayed with him forever. Born on June 15, 1937 in Littlefield, Texas, Waylon Jennings would become one of the defining voices of outlaw country music. But before the fame, before the records, and before helping reshape country music, he experienced an event that stayed with him for the rest of his life. In 1959, Jennings was a young musician playing bass in Buddy Holly's band during the Winter Dance Party Tour. The tour itself was exhausting. Long bus rides, winter weather, poor travel conditions. Eventually, Buddy Holly decided to charter a small airplane after one of the shows. Jennings gave up his seat on that flight to fellow musician J.P. the Big Bopper Richardson, who was suffering from the flu. Another seat went to the young guitarist Ritchie Valens. Before takeoff, Buddy Holly reportedly joked to Jennings, "Well, I hope your old bus freezes up." Jennings fired back a joke of his own. "Well, I hope your old plane crashes." It was the kind of teasing exchange musicians had all the time. A few hours later, the plane went down in Iowa. Everyone aboard was killed. The tragedy became known as the day the music died. And for decades afterward, Jennings carried guilt about that final conversation. He often spoke about wondering whether he should have taken the flight, whether he could have changed something, whether the joke should have been left unsaid. Logically, he knew none of it caused the crash. Emotionally, things are rarely that simple. What's remarkable is that Jennings continued building a career despite carrying that burden. Over the years, he became one of country music's most influential artists, helping create the outlaw country movement alongside Willie Nelson and others. His music emphasized independence, authenticity, and doing things his own way. Yet, even after decades of success, interviews often return to that winter night in 1959, because some moments become permanent companions. Not because they define a life, but because they remain part of the story. And Waylon Jennings carried that chapter with him for the rest of his. Looking back across today's stories, I noticed that each one involved people trying to solve a problem. How do you limit power? How do you save a life? How do you feed a busy city? The solutions were imperfect, sometimes messy, sometimes controversial. Yet those efforts push things forward. History often looks dramatic from a distance, but a surprising amount of it comes down to people trying to make tomorrow work a little better than today. Anyway, that's what I ended up finding while working through June 15th. And before I go, here's today's oddly appropriate quote. Civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking about them. Alfred North Whitehead. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and your guide through the moments where humanity somehow became both impressive and ridiculous simultaneously.